As we have seen, the program for removing God and dismissing biblical ideas involves several elements. First, the validity of the Bible was assaulted directly by hostile biblical criticism. Plausible-sounding un-Bible stories for nature and history were formulated and embraced quickly. The propaganda necessary to discredit the Bible and promote the replacement stories was underway. The last element was redefining science in terms of atheistic philosophy so that materialistic naturalism would be equated with science and God could be eliminated from consideration by definition. Let's be sure we grasp what materialistic naturalism is all about. Materialism is the belief that physical matter is the extent of reality, all there is, and the supernatural realm and everything included, God, supernatural interventions, angels, demons, fixed moral values, ultimate accountability and judgment, eternal life, and so on, are unreal, imaginary fiction. Naturalism is the belief that natural processes are the only shapers of matter, with an inherent creative tendency to organize matter into higher, more complex forms, even capable of transforming inanimate matter into animate, living forms. It is this philosophical belief, rather than observation and evidence, that underlies the belief that life arose from inanimate matter by natural processes alone, and that humans developed from an ape-like common ancestor by Darwinian processes. Having rejected the supernatural, evolutionary progress by natural processes became the only possible explanation, and this is why evolution stories were embraced so confidently and emphatically, even when supportive evidence was minimal or non-existent. Accordingly, the very conception of science itself was changed, and it was blended with an assumed materialistic naturalism. In effect, the Enlightenment created a hybrid concept of science that some have called scientism, the view that science is the only objective means by which to determine what is true, and the aura of science is applied to viewpoints that are not rooted in the observation and evidence associated with traditional science, but in the a priori assumption that materialistic naturalism stories must be true. Traditional science is an objective and philosophically neutral method of investigation. Observe, collect and analyze evidence, and then follow the evidence wherever it leads. If natural processes do inherently organize matter into ever higher levels of order and can turn inanimate chemicals into life, so be it. If natural processes cannot do that, and evidence points to an intelligent designer of nature, so be it. Materialistic naturalism science is a different critter because it is based on a pre-commitment to the beliefs that only physical matter is real and natural processes alone can and have shaped it into its various forms, including life. While hiding under the labels of traditional science, this approach begins by limiting the possible answers to those in harmony with its philosophical position. Thus, the God answer is automatically eliminated from any consideration as an explanation of reality, and philosophically derived materialistic naturalism explanations are assumed to be true even if there are no observations or evidence to support the story. As I noted before, traditional science recognized a limit to what science could study, but materialism views what science can study as the limit or extent of reality. The key point you need to grasp is that there are two very different conceptions of science. Traditional science was based on observations, evidence, and then followed the evidence wherever it led. Materialism masquerades as science, but assumes philosophical materialistic naturalism to be true, and then will only consider no-God, un-Bible explanations. To recognize what has occurred, remember the Trojan horse. The horse was left outside the city of Troy, apparently as a gift, but Greek soldiers were hiding inside, and after the horse was wheeled inside the city, they came out at night and opened the gates for the rest of Odysseus's army. Think of the redefined concepts of reason and science as the Greek soldiers, hiding under the cover of the traditional concepts and coming out later when unexpected. Once science was equated with materialistic naturalism, the horse was inside the city, and it was only a matter of time before God could be eliminated, by definition, from anything related to science. When you know what to look for, you can see it in the conflicting descriptions of science that have appeared in textbooks and journal comments by leading evolutionists over the years. The traditional concept of science is the ideal offered to the public, and it is what most of us learned. All science begins with observation, the first step of the scientific method. At once this delimits the scientific domain, something that cannot be observed, cannot be investigated by science. One-time events on Earth are outside of science. Anything to which the scientific method can be applied, now or in the future, is or will be science. Anything to which the method cannot be applied is not science. Science exists because of the evidence. Observation, hypothesis, and testing. That's what science is. It is a central tenet of science that any theory must be testable and grounded in evidence, not belief. Evidence and proven facts are central to the scientific method. Well, that sounds good. The most basic characteristics of science are things like observation, evidence, and the scientific method. However, the Greek soldiers come out unexpectedly and declare that the most basic or central characteristic of science is now something very different, a philosophical pre-commitment to materialistic naturalism, a philosophical position that automatically excludes the supernatural from reality, regardless of what the evidence looks like. It fails to display the most basic characteristic of science, reliance upon naturalistic explanations. The first criterion is that any scientific theory must be naturalistic. A central tenet of modern science is methodological naturalism. And in any event, creation is an unacceptable explanation to science because it requires the invoking of a force outside of nature to account for natural events, thus violating one of the fundamental ground rules of science. George Gaylord Simpson admitted that science was now operating with a bias towards materialism that is even inherent in the scientific method, treating nature as though it is purely materialistic or naturalistic and rejecting any metaphysical hypothesis as long as possible. One of the rules of science is no miracles allowed. That's a fundamental presumption of what we do. The supernatural is automatically off limits as an explanation of the natural world. Science is fundamentally a game. It's a game with one overriding and defining rule. And that rule is, let's see how far and to what extent we can explain the behavior of the physical and material universe in terms of purely physical and material causes, without invoking the supernatural. Harvard biologist George Wald demonstrated what a foundational commitment to atheism over following the evidence looks like when he admitted that Pasteur had demolished the spontaneous generation of life from inanimate matter notion, and the only alternative was special creation. He acknowledged that spontaneous generation of life was impossible, but to avoid the creation explanation, he would believe and advocate the spontaneous generation notion anyway. His atheism was more important than following the evidence. Why would a noted scientist admit that spontaneous generation was scientifically disproven and impossible, declare the only alternative to be special creation, but then refused to consider the only alternative, preferring to cling to what he knew to be disproven and impossible. Well, there has been a major worldview shift from the Christian setting in which Western science originated to an atheistic worldview in which God and the Bible are forbidden explanations. In 1965, Harvard geologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote an article, "Is Uniformitarianism Necessary?" in the American Journal of Science. In that article, he declared Hutton and Lyell's uniformitarian geology to be incorrect, should be abandoned, and confined to the past history of geology. However, he identified one positive for this erroneous idea. It enabled Lyell to exclude the miraculous, eliminate supernatural explanations, and remove the supernatural from our thinking about the past. So for these guys, even bad science is useful if it eliminates God from our thinking, which reminds me of Genesis 3, 1-6, where removing God from Eve's thinking was exactly what the serpent was trying to do. There is a spiritual dimension in anti-God science. In the mid-1970s, a noted Harvard biologist, Ernst Mayr, admitted that Darwinism was not as much about science as shifting Western civilization's worldview away from God to a worldview in which there was no room for God. In effect, atheism. 20 years later, another noted biologist, Richard Lewontin, provided a revealing admission about how the commitment to materialistic philosophy had changed science.
Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment. A commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced, by our a priori adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation, and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
So, an important element in the science and supernatural struggle is that materialistic science has some patently absurd constructs, has failed to deliver on some of its promises, and tolerates unsubstantiated just-so stories. This commitment to materialism is not required by the methods of science, but this a priori, or before-the-facts commitment to materialism has caused science to be retooled into a system that will produce materialistic explanations that are counterintuitive and mystifying. But the materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. This is why mainstream evolutionists equally oppose biblical creation, theistic evolution, and intelligent design, because each of them bring the supernatural back into the discussion of reality. Modern science has become, essentially, an officially atheistic movement, and they do not want God allowed back into the picture of reality in any way. As Richard Lewontin said, the materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. In the original Cosmos video and book, Carl Sagan, a famous scientist, openly proclaimed the foundational philosophical doctrine of atheism. The physical universe is all there is, ever was, or will ever be. The clear implication: there is no God. As avowed atheists, Richard Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson have openly ridiculed God, declaring him a delusion and an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. So, with that kind of mindset in control of science, evidence in the natural order pointing to its creator will be interpreted as something else or suppressed, as Romans 1:18-20 says.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made.
Two of the best summaries of what has happened that I've seen came from Frank Turek.
Atheists have, simply, assumed the materialistic worldview is true, and defined the rules of science, in such a way that the only possible answer is a materialistic theory, like Darwinism.
And Scott Todd.
Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science, because it is not naturalistic.
The underlying struggle is not a matter of science versus Christianity, as much as a worldview conflict over the very nature of science itself. The traditional concept of science got along just fine with the Judeo-Christian worldview because it was about following the evidence wherever it led. So evidence pointing to an intelligent designer behind the natural order could be recognized for what it was. However, atheists hijacked the good name of science and distorted it so that it would promote their agenda by only allowing atheistic explanations. Spiritual warfare is not about the demons under your bed, but the false ideas that the devil wants to put in your head. This is what Paul was talking about when he portrayed our war as being against the philosophies and speculations raised up against the knowledge of God, the ideas of demonic origin that would be spread by men without consciences, and the worldly and empty chatter and opposing arguments of falsely called knowledge that leads people away from God. These warnings are still very appropriate for Western civilization. If I was the devil, I would work hard to get my people into leadership positions of government, academia, and the media, so that God and the Bible could be continually ridiculed and dismissed from people's thinking, while promoting God-free on Bible stories as the only possible explanations. Well, don't be too trusting towards secular scholarship, because there are two different concepts of reason and science out there, and some of their stories are more concerned with discrediting the Bible than understanding reality. And don't be overly skeptical of the Bible, for accumulating evidence accords very well with what the Bible says about nature and reality.